up. And we have what should be a larger area sort of taped off and a skinny area. Right now that skinny area is not going to be what we're worried about. We're just going to use the larger area. These are the plastic palettes that we use. Vocabulary wise, this is a palette. The little dimples down here are called wells. Okay, that's where the water goes. We've got two types of brushes that we're using. We're using flat brushes and round brushes. The flat brush is obviously cut straight across over here and it's flat this way. This one's obviously round. There are different sizes, but these are the two main types of brushes that we're going to be using today. The watercolor that we're using is the sort of grown-up good stuff. It's the liquid watercolor. Many of you might have used watercolor when you were a kid that looked like almost like makeup cases or little cakes that you added water to. This is just the higher grade professional level stuff. It's in a little tiny tube. Why is it in a little tiny tube? Because you only need a little bit. Any more than this and you are just wasting paint. These little tiny tubes, as crazy as it sounds, is enough paint for all of us to paint all of our projects in both of my classes painting through the whole rest of this course. That being said, I know some of you are going to waste some. All you need is a teardrop's worth. And where I put it on top of the well so that I can add paint to the well as I need to mix it. It's obviously a liquid, but this is watercolor. We're never going to work with the paint without adding at least a little bit of water. Now, how much is the right amount? For what we're going to do today, we only need a few drops of water. Somebody always thinks that they're like being really efficient and slick by taking a cup and pouring water into here. It's stupid. You need like the size of a contact lens, or maybe a little bit bigger. 3 or 4 drops of water. I put those 3 or 4 drops in off my brush by dipping my brush in and just wiping it off on the edge. The reason why I like to set up the well like this is because when we add paint to this, okay, we can control how dark or how light it is. Now, as soon as I add paint to it, that little, what's called a wash, all right, the water and the paint down in the well is called a wash. Once I mix paint in that wash looks pretty dark right off the bat. But if I dip and wipe and then test it out on my paper, you can see it's relatively light. It's not necessarily going to be true to what it looks like here. That's why we mix first. For our purposes, we want to be able to control how dark or how light we're making that wash. In this case, for the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to use most of the paint that we squeeze out. So even though I'm having it set up like this, I do want you to kind of pretty much use what you squeeze out, just that teardrop's worth. In a couple of droplets of water, I'm going to mix that thoroughly so it isn't all concentrated on my brush so I don't get streaky marks. Okay, the first brush we're going to use is the flat brush. The purpose of the flat brush originally, it was before the printing press. Monks used to hand paint pages for the Bible, and they would do lettering with flat brushes. That hard edge is pretty conducive to making good crisp lines. Now what we want to do with the watercolor when we're painting is we want to be able to paint and use this like a marker. We don't want to scoop up water and slather it all over the place. We want to use this precisely. We don't want big drips or puddles. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to get in the practice of dipping and then wiping. You should get a big bead of water that comes off of your brush before you go over here. The first thing we're going to try to do is use the thin side of this and just touch the paper with our brush. All right, our goal is to try to make as thin a line as possible. Okay, they're going to be hand painted, so they're not going to be perfect, but our job is to try to just have the edge of the brush touch the paper without pressing down and then just drag it across. Even for me, I need practice doing this, so that's why we're doing it. We're going to try to do as many as we can, as long as they're clean and crisp looking. You can take a look at what I've done so far over here and you can see the marks that I'm making. Maybe, just maybe, you'll have a little bit of excess water at the end, but what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to dip and not wipe and show you what they look like. Okay? Big, blotchy messes. If I drag my finger across the ones I've done so far, they're already soaked into the paper. If I drag my finger across that, it's a big mess. So that's why we have to dip and wipe. We don't want puddles on the paper. If I were to lift this paper up and shake it, if this paint looks like it was going to drip off, that's a problem. So what I'm going to do over here really quickly is I'm going to take a little excess water, just some clean water, I'm going to go ahead while that's still all really wet, and I'm going to sort of soak it in a little bit, and then I'm going to do what's called a lift. With a lift, I'll just take some paper towel. When you do a lift, don't ever drag the paper across your paper. Just kind of like dab it up lightly. It's not going to work like a perfect little eraser. Like, you're not going to be able to make it look like it's never been there before, but that's basically all we can do to erase things. Since that piece of paper right here is wet right now, I can't really go over wet paper and make it nice, crisp line. So if you're doing that and you're still practicing, dip, wipe that excess water off your brush, and then go to a dry part of the paper and continue practicing. Okay? It's not important to me that you get them perfect right off the bat. It's important to me that you get the right feel for how much water and paint should be on your brush at any one time, and you get a little bit of control over how thin or thick you can make your lines. That's with the flat brush. Those are thin. We're going to do, with the flat brush, a slightly different part. We're now going to do the thick. The thicker lines are a little bit more complicated because you really have to pay a little bit more attention to how much water you have on your brush. You might have noticed I just dipped once and I was able to make a bunch of lines without even having to going back for more. For this, I'm going to dip, I'm going to wipe, and then I want to make thick sort of bricks. Okay? Now, when you make these bricks, you might find that you have a little excess water at the very end of it. That's okay. If you find that you have a large puddle, that's no good. The goal of these things is to make nice, solid colored rectangles and have really crisp little white spaces between them. All right? You can obviously see that you can make quite a few of these with one shot, but as soon as your brush starts sort of giving up, like it misses a spot, or the edges of your marks get a little sort of staticky and you can see the bumps of the paper and the grooves of the paper. Once that starts happening, that's when you're starting to get something called dry brush. And that's when you want to get in here and add just a little bit more paint and go right over them. If you're using this stuff properly, you will find that it should absorb into the paper relatively quickly, and even after just a couple of seconds, should be relatively dry to the touch. If you're experiencing something like this, where you're getting large, sort of blotchy sort of painting, if I were to lift this up a little bit and have my paint, you can notice when I lift it up on an angle, the paint starts running down into a little puddle down over here. That's not what we want. That's too much water. To remedy that, what you can do is you can take your brush, dry it off completely with the paper towel, and then use your brush to come back. It'll kind of sop it up almost like a mop. So what we're trying to do is learn what's the right amount of water, what's too much water on dry paper. How do we fix mistakes? By going over it with a dry brush, by going over water and lifting it. These are the marks that we're making with our flat brush. Like I said before, the flat brush was initially used for the purposes of calligraphy and things like that. What I'm going to do now is I'll do one letter. You guys can practice a letter or two on your thing. You could do like your initials if you'd like. We're going to dip. We're going to wipe. The rule of thumb that we're going to use for that is that for verticals, we're going to make verticals thick. Okay? So the verticals will be the thick part of the brush. Horizontals we'll make thin. Okay? I'll do my letter B. If I want to get cute, I can kind of come in and all fancy and add little flags and little things like that. But we want to try to use thick for the most part for verticals, thin for horizontals. All right? And you could do a couple different letters. We are using this entire area over here as practice, so you should do as many of these as you need to feel good about them. We're going to do one other mark. We're going to switch now to the round brush. Okay? The round brush comes to a point. These are brand new brushes, so what you might find with the brand new brushes, they have a little coating on them. So make sure you really kind of rinse them through so they are nice and soft. We're going to go once again. The round brush is a little bit more challenging to use. All right, there's a little bit more variation in how much water is going to be on the brush. So when we dip, we'll kind of dip, we'll wipe, and we'll see if it works out on the first one. If it doesn't work on the first one, we know that we have to use the brush with a little bit more paint or a little bit less. The mark we're going to try to make, I kind of call it like a chili pepper. It should be very thin at first, then thick, then thin. The idea is to try to keep that brush on the paper in one swoop where you can go thin, thick, and then thin again. Dip, wipe, thin, just touch the paper, thick, press down, thin, pull back up. In this case, in the middle of this one, I started to get some what's called dry brush. I missed a little bit. I didn't have quite enough water on the brush. I can go back over that one. But the next time I do this, what I'd like to do is try to, experiment and leave a little bit more paint on the brush. Okay? So that's getting that touch. We are practicing learning what's the right amount, what's the wrong amount of paint on the brush. We're trying to get experience so that when we go back later on, we're trying to paint a landscape or we're trying to paint trees or mountains or houses and things like that, we have a good feel for this. The last mark we're going to make over here with our round brush, we're going to try to go on the upswing thin, on the downswing thick, on the upswing thin, down thick, up thin, down thick, kind of like a ribbon, where you see the brushes start to run out of paint, dip, wipe, and then just try to pick up where you left off. Thick, and thin, and thick. All right. Our goal for this piece of paper on this particular side is to get all 4 of those marks and a couple letters in there. So my goal for you is whatever it is, each and every one of you should fill this whole square up. Okay? Fill it up with marks. Whichever marks you're struggling with most, do more of them. If you ace some of them and you feel really good about some, do a few and move on to the other ones. But we have thin lines with the flat, thick bricks with the flat, chili pepper or banana-like kind of marks here, and then the ribbon. You can put your initial on it. If you notice, I still left this empty side over here completely empty. Don't do anything on this little strip over here. Everything should be in the larger area. These things we're going to have to put to the side. Find a space in the room because our drying rack is kind of full with portraits right now. But this is what we're doing for today. You can use whatever color you want, but I've only put out basically a couple of the darker ones. Green, crimson, blue. You can use this kind of like reddish orange or brown. Those are the colors that I'd like you guys to use. I'm going to leave this tray in the middle over here. The brushes are all in the middle over here. They're brand new. The trays are over in the sink. The watercolor, even if it's dry, you can wash it off with just a little bit of water. So just rinse your